In this video, we're going to look at Peter Singer's principle of equality. This principle plays an important part in Singer's argument for the view that the common distinction we make between killing human beings and killing animals is morally unjustified, or speciesist, as Singer says. But before we can look at this argument, we need to come to terms with what his principle of equality says. Singer begins by asking the question, what equality is? What do we mean when we say that all human beings are equal? Obviously, it's not the case that we all share the same characteristics. Some of us have darker skin than others. Some of us have different coloured hair. Some of us have a different sex, and some of us are of a different height, and so on. Singer develops his principle of equality in close connection to his preference utilitarianism, and in particular, that first base argument for preference utilitarianism that we saw at the start of his practical ethics. You'll recall that Singer starts by asking, what does it mean to live by ethical standards? To live according to ethical standards, or to justify one's conduct according to ethical standards, means going beyond your own selfish interests and your own narrow point of view to a more universal, impartial perspective in which you take everyone's interests into account equally. This insight about what makes conduct ethical lies behind Singer's principle of the equal consideration of interests. To be truly impartial in our justifications, to be truly impartial in our conduct, we must weigh interests simply as interests, and not as interests held by black people, by disabled people, people of superior intelligences, and so on. So what does the principle of the equal consideration of interests say? Singer says, the essence of the principle of equal consideration of interests is that we give equal weight in our moral deliberations to the like interests of all those affected by our actions. In a nutshell, he says, we must treat like interests alike. He also says that an interest is an interest, whoever's interest it might be, regardless of the interest bearer, regardless of the person who actually has the interest or holds the interest, regardless of that person's sex or race or level of intelligence, and so on. So let's unpack this idea. First of all, we might be asking ourselves, well, what are interests? I mean, we all have interests, don't we? We have an interest in stopping watching this video and getting on the internet and looking up funny cat videos. But clearly, some interests are more important than other interests. We might think that there's a kind of hierarchy of interests, in which my interests in watching cat videos are way down the list, but my interest in having food, and having shelter, and being loved and cared for and so on are way up the top of the list. So here are some of the most important interests. Core interests, Singer calls them. Having food and shelter, avoiding pain, not just avoiding pain, but having one's pain relieved when one is in pain, being loved and cared for, being free, and this last one here, our interest in continuing to live, might in fact be conceived as the most important interest that many of us will have, given that in order to enjoy having our need for food and shelter met, in order to be loved and cared for, we must go on living. It's an important precondition for having any of those other interests that we actually continue to live and to flourish. Okay, so now that we know what interests are and what the important interests are, how does Singer's principle work in practice? He says, let's imagine that you find yourself in an earthquake and you come across two victims of the earthquake. The first has a gash in his thigh. The second has a horribly broken leg. Now you are in charge of medical supplies and you have 2 doses of morphine. Now, as you are weighing up whether or not you should distribute the medicine equally, you should keep in mind that Thigh-Gash is suffering from, well, just a certain mild discomfort from having a deep gash in the thigh. Broken Leg, on the other hand, is in extraordinary pain, an agonizing torment as a result of having broken her leg in numerous places. So, what does Peter Singer's principle say that I should do in these cases? I have 2 doses of morphine. Should I give both doses to Broken Leg? Or should I distribute the drug equally between Broken Leg and Thigh-Gash? Well, the principle of the equal consideration of interest says that in one's moral deliberation, one should give equal weight to the like interests of all those affected by your action. So we might start up weighing up the interest that Thigh-Gash and Broken Leg have in a dose of morphine. Okay, and we might think, first off, that they both have an equal interest in the relief of pain. But then if we think about it more carefully, Broken Leg has a much stronger interest in the relief of pain, a much more weighty interest than that of Thigh-Gash, who is in some mild discomfort. And on the basis of that, we might think that Broken Leg's pain tips the balance in her favour such that she should be given both doses of morphine. Now, it might be useful here to think of the moral deliberation process as like a kind of weighing up process with a set of scales, a set of old-fashioned scales. Now, the scales might be tipped if interests are stronger and weightier on one side. Likewise, the scales might also be tipped if there are more interests to be met on one side rather than the other. But a crucial point to bring out is that Singer's principle of equality does not guarantee equal treatment or imply that there will be equal outcomes for all, but rather that there will be equal consideration of interests, that equal weight will be given to interests. To bring out this point, now let's imagine that you are a charity worker whose job it is to find shelter for the homeless. On the one hand, you have Bill. He's a homeless man who's been looking for shelter for quite some time and has been on a wait list. And then there's Jill. She's also looking for shelter. She's just fled from an abusive relationship. But she's not alone. She has 3 small children in her care. So, as a charity worker, you can only give a home or housing to one of these parties. Who's it going to be? What does Singer's principle of equal consideration of interests say that you should do? Pause the video for a moment to consider your options. Did you come up with D, give the apartment to Jill? This does seem to be what the principle of equal consideration of interests would recommend. On Singer's view, several interests can combine to outweigh a small number of similar interests. In this case, an interest in receiving shelter. All that counts in our moral deliberations on this principle is interests, not the race, sex, or intelligence of the person who owns the interests. Now, you might think it's a bit of a problem that the principle has resulted in an inegalitarian outcome, where Bill does not have housing while Jill does. But on second glance, it might be a more equal outcome than it appears to be, because if you consider the fact that Jill and all her dependents were suffering 3 times the distress that Bill was, when they're given housing, the level of satisfaction overall is reasonably equalised. Now, let's turn to the consequences of Singer's principle for arbitrary forms of moral discrimination. We're going to be looking at discrimination against animals in the coming week. Let us, for the moment, look at the consequences of Singer's principle for how we treat people of other races. Now, intuitively speaking, we tend to think that certain racist practices, racism as a whole, is morally wrong. So before we look at the consequences of Singer's principle for racism, let's look at a test case, the African slave trade in the early modern period, and ask ourselves, intuitively speaking, what made the racism of that period wrong? And one of the first answers we might point to is the certain racist beliefs and sentiments that were upheld by the African slave traders of the period. Those beliefs that the Africans constituted an inferior human species or inferior specimens of the human species. And also we might think that the slave trade was wrong on the basis of certain emotions and attitudes that were expressed towards those Africans. Hatred, perhaps, and fear, but perhaps more disturbingly, a certain cruel indifference to the suffering that was brought about when those Africans were taken from their homes and sent across the seas and condemned to lives of slavery on the plantations in America. And finally, and most obviously, we might think that such racism was wrong because of certain practices, in particular the practice of causing harm to the Africans by robbing them of their freedom and their family and their lives generally. Now we might ask ourselves, what does the principle of equality have to say about the wrongness of racism? Perhaps most obviously, it's going to begin by condemning those practices and policies where the interests of Africans, in particular their core interests in being relieved of pain, in being loved and cared for and continuing to live, were completely and cruelly disregarded. So what are the consequences of Singer's principle for how we treat people of other races? Well, clearly, the principle says, in our moral deliberations, we must give equal weight to the like interests of all those affected. And as we know, an interest is an interest regardless of the interest bearer, regardless of whose interest it is, regardless of the colour of their skin. Race is simply irrelevant when it comes to our moral deliberations, according to this principle. But before we end today, let's look at a few potential inadequacies or criticisms of this principle, especially with regards to the wrongness of racism. Notice that Singer's principle doesn't really have much way of condemning those negative racist attitudes we mentioned before, feelings such as hatred and fear and cruel indifference, provided that the interests of individuals are given equal consideration. It shouldn't matter what the moral deliberators' attitudes and feelings are on Singer's principle. Unless, of course, those attitudes and feelings result in a certain trampling on others' interests, a cruel disregard for others' interests. And we might think, to be fair to Singer, those attitudes and feelings often do result in this disregard for interests. Secondly, however, we might look to the early modern period and think, well, racist interests counted for quite a lot in that period. It was thought that the interests of the slave holders carried much more weight than the interests of the slaves. The slave traders' interest in turning a profit and flourishing counted for more than the slaves' interest in leading free and flourishing lives. And now, of course, we, from our perspective, find that utterly morally repugnant. But in a society in which racist interests, for some reason, did happen to count for more, it does seem as though, from the wider perspective of Singer's preference utilitarianism, that these interests would tip the balance in favour of racist interests being counted for more. That's a problem. That's a disturbing consequence of Singer's principle. But in any case, we'll end the discussion here this time, and next time move on to looking at how Singer's principle is supposed to apply to the treatment of animals.